The first thing I noticed was the sound. Not the music stopping or the room going quiet, but the sharp crack that echoed off the ballroom walls like someone had dropped a plate. For a split second, no one reacted. 200 people froze at the exact same time, like the whole room had missed a step. My head had already turned to the side before my brain caught up. My left cheek burned instantly hot and tight, like someone had pressed a flat iron against my skin. I tasted blood. Somewhere near my feet, something small bounced once on the marble floor and slid to a stop. I didn't look down yet. I already knew what it was. My mother's hand was still in the air. No one said a word. Not my father. Not my sister. Not the wedding planner who had been smiling so hard her face looked painful a moment earlier. Even the band had stopped mid-note. The microphone in my mother's other hand picked up her breathing, loud and uneven, filling the silence she'd just created. I stood there and did what the army teaches you to do when something goes wrong in public. Don't react. Don't escalate. Take inventory. 200 guests. Multiple phones raised. At least one camera light still on. My commanding posture intact. My heart steady. My dignity bruised, but not gone. I slowly turned my head back toward her. She looked shocked, like she hadn't meant to do it, like her body had moved before her mind gave permission. That didn't make it better. It made it worse. On the floor between us, my diamond earring caught the light from the chandeliers. Someone near the front gasped. A woman at table 7 covered her mouth. I recognized her. A neighbor of my parents'. She'd once told me she admired how independent I was, the way people say that when they don't quite approve. I bent down and picked up the earring. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me more than the slap. I wiped the back of my hand across my lip, felt the sting again, then straightened up and put the earring back on. The clasp clicked into place. Clean, precise. The way I liked things. Only then did I look around the room. Every eye was on me. The wedding reception had been in full swing minutes earlier. Champagne glasses half full. Linen napkins folded just right. White roses everywhere. My sister Ashley had been glowing, floating from table to table in her dress, like this was the best day of her life. And now all of that felt thin, fragile, like a set that could collapse if someone leaned too hard on the wrong wall. I heard my father clear his throat. He didn't say my name. My mother finally lowered her hand. The microphone slipped a little in her grip. Rachel, she said, like the word itself had betrayed her. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I took a step back then, another creating space between us. The kind of space that makes people uncomfortable because it signals something has shifted and they don't know how to fix it. I turned toward the head table. Ashley was staring at me. Her hands pressed to her chest, her face pale under the makeup. For once, she wasn't sure what expression to wear. Shock? Guilt? Relief? Maybe all three. Congratulations, I said. My voice carried farther than I expected. Calm, even. I hope today turns out exactly how you planned. Someone let out a nervous laugh. It died quickly. I reached for my clutch, still sitting neatly under my chair where I'd placed it earlier. Habit. Always put your things where you can grab them without fumbling. I stood smooth the front of my dress once and walked toward the exit. No rushing, no dramatic pause, just movement. Behind me, voices started up all at once. Confused, angry, whispered, loud. I didn't turn around to see who was saying what. I didn't need to. I'd heard the same tones my entire life. Disappointment dressed up as concern. Control masquerading as love. The ballroom doors closed behind me, cutting the noise in half. The hallway outside was quiet, carpeted, softly lit. The air felt cooler. My cheek still burned, but the sting had sharpened into something useful. Focus. I pulled my phone from my clutch as I walked. 3 missed notifications. 1 text preview already lighting up the screen. Are you okay? I didn't answer it yet. The elevator arrived. I stepped inside alone and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut. The mirrored walls reflected my face back at me. Red mark on my cheek. Eyes steady. Posture straight. I exhaled slowly. When the doors opened again, the lobby was crowded with guests coming and going, oblivious to what had just happened upstairs. Someone laughed near the bar. A valet called out a ticket number. Life moving forward whether anyone was ready or not. I walked out the front doors and into the night air. That's when my phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't family. I stepped off to the side out of the flow of guests and answered. "Rachel," the voice said. "I just saw the video." I closed my eyes for half a second, then opened them again. Of course he had. "Okay," I said. "Here's what happened." As I spoke, I watched the hotel windows above me. Lights glowing. Music resuming somewhere. A wedding trying to pretend it was still intact. I kept my voice factual. Dates, actions, words used, the way I'd been trained to report anything that might matter later. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Do you need medical attention?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm fine." Another pause. Longer this time. "All right," he said. "Then do exactly what you're doing now. Don't say anything else. Don't engage. We'll take it from here." I ended the call and slid the phone back into my clutch. For the first time since the slap, I let myself feel the heat in my cheek again. Not anger, not embarrassment, just the physical reminder that something had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Behind me, the doors opened and a group of guests spilled out onto the steps, still laughing, still unaware. One of them glanced at me, then looked away quickly like he wasn't sure whether acknowledging me would make things worse. I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the city, the traffic, the distant hum of everything continuing as normal, and adjusted the strap of my clutch on my shoulder, already moving forward as if I had somewhere else to be. I kept walking until the hotel disappeared behind me and the night air stopped feeling like an audience. My heel caught slightly on the edge of the sidewalk, and I adjusted my pace without breaking stride, the same way I'd learned to do years ago, when you don't give discomfort the satisfaction of slowing you down. Being out of step with my family wasn't new. What was new was how visible it had become. Growing up, I was the problem child without ever doing anything wrong. I followed rules. I got good grades. I didn't sneak out or get into trouble. But I asked questions and I didn't soften my voice when I spoke. That alone seemed to irritate my mother more than any actual misbehavior ever could. Ashley never had that issue. She learned early how to tilt her head just enough, how to let silence work for her, how to make people want to step in and smooth things over. Teachers loved her. Relatives adored her. My parents glowed when they talked about her like she was proof they'd done something right. I was the contrast. At family dinners, my opinions were a bit intense. When I talked about school or work, I was too serious. If I corrected someone, I was difficult. If I stayed quiet, I was cold. There was never a version of me that fit comfortably at the table, so eventually I stopped trying. The army hadn't been an act of rebellion. That's what my parents liked to tell people, though. I joined because I wanted structure, accountability, and a place where expectations were stated clearly instead of implied, and then held against you later. I wanted rules that didn't change depending on someone's mood. When I told my parents I'd enlisted, my mother cried like I'd announced I was moving to another planet. My father nodded tight-lipped, already calculating how this choice would inconvenience the family. Ashley hugged me and said I could never do that like it was a compliment. From that point on, everything I achieved was framed as a detour. Temporary. A phase I'd grow out of once I came to my senses and returned to the life they'd imagined for me. Marriage. Kids. A job that didn't require acronyms or deployments. Every promotion came with a comment about how lonely it must be. Every deployment came with a reminder that I was missing important family moments. I wasn't invited to complain, but I was expected to compensate. Money was the easiest way. When my parents needed help with a shortfall at the business, they called me. When Ashley needed help with rent in her first apartment, I wired the money. When my father mentioned casually that the wedding budget was getting a little tight, I didn't ask for details. I transferred the funds. Quietly. No announcements. No credit. That was my role. The reliable one. The one who didn't need applause. The irony was that they still treated my career like a hobby. Something interesting but not real. Not like my father's company, which was serious. Not like Ashley's upcoming marriage, which was a real commitment. I'd learned not to argue that point. Explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you is a losing strategy. That pattern followed me right up to the wedding. From the moment I arrived, my presence felt like a disruption. My mother scanned me up and down, her smile tightening just a fraction too late. "You look very professional," she said, like it was an accusation. "Ashley looked beautiful." I meant that. Her dress fit perfectly, and she wore happiness the way some people wear jewelry effortlessly. I told her she looked great. She thanked me, distracted, already being pulled into another conversation where she belonged. I hovered at the edges, fixing a crooked place card here, moving an extra chair there. Small tasks, useful tasks, the kind that let you stay busy without being noticed. That was when I heard my mother's voice drop. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I was reaching for a stack of programs when I caught my name spoken the way you say something that isn't meant to travel far. "She won't say no," my mother said. "Not in front of everyone." My father made a sound of agreement. "She'll hate it, but she'll do it. She always does." There it was. Not a question. Not a hope. A certainty. They weren't talking about seating charts or timing or flowers. They were talking about me. About counting on my silence. About using the room, the guests, the moment itself as leverage. I stood there still, my hand resting on the edge of the table, feeling something settle into place. Ashley joined them a moment later. She didn't ask what they were talking about. She smiled, nodded, and said, "It's not like she needs it," with the kind of casual dismissal that only comes from never having had to earn something yourself. No one noticed me step back. No one looked up. I could have confronted them then. Pulled my mother aside. Asked what exactly they thought they were doing. That would have been the expected move. Emotional, reactive, easy to dismiss as overthinking. Instead, I did nothing. I finished straightening the programs. I walked away. I made a mental note and filed it where I kept everything else that mattered. That wasn't avoidance. It was preparation. The rest of the afternoon passed in pieces. Smiles, small talk, familiar jokes at my expense that everyone pretended were harmless. I felt the plan tightening around me the way you can sense a briefing moving toward its conclusion. By the time the reception started, I knew exactly what they intended to do. I also knew something they didn't. For once, I wasn't walking into that room unprepared. Standing there earlier with my mother's hand still hanging in the air and my earring on the floor, I'd seen the same thing in her eyes that I'd seen years ago whenever I refused to bend quickly enough. Shock. Then anger. Then the urge to force compliance. What she never understood was that compliance had always been a choice, not a weakness. I reached my car and unlocked it, sliding into the driver's seat and closing the door behind me. The interior light came on, briefly illuminating my face in the mirror. The mark on my cheek was darker now, more defined. Proof if anyone needed it. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, not looking back at the hotel once. My phone buzzed again on the passenger seat, another message lighting up the screen. I let it buzz. Somewhere behind me, my family was scrambling to regain control of a narrative they'd assumed belonged to them. Somewhere ahead, I was already making a different set of decisions, the kind that don't require permission and don't announce themselves before they take effect. The steering wheel felt cool under my palms as I merged onto the main road, the muscle memory of driving after a long day kicking in without thought. I adjusted the rearview mirror not to check my face again, but to make sure the road behind me was clear, then settled into the lane and let the car move at a steady, legal pace. Control has a rhythm to it. Once you learn it, you don't rush. I hadn't learned that at home. I learned it in uniform. The Army doesn't care how you feel about a task. It cares whether you can execute it under pressure without creating new problems. That distinction matters. Feelings pass. Consequences stick around. Early on, that difference saved me from making a lot of bad decisions that would have felt good for about 30 seconds and cost me for years. On my first deployment, I was assigned to a logistics team that lived and died by timelines. Fuel convoys, medical supplies, food. Parts that looked insignificant until something failed and suddenly everyone wanted to know why a shipment hadn't arrived. I learned quickly that if you didn't speak clearly, people filled in the gaps themselves. If you didn't set boundaries, they assumed you had none. That applied to people too. Rank doesn't eliminate pressure. It organizes it. Someone always wants something faster, cheaper, or bent just enough to make their problem go away. The Army drills into you that no is a complete sentence when safety ethics or protocol are on the line. You don't apologize for it. You don't decorate it. You state it, document it, and move on. The first time I said no to a senior officer, my stomach tightened so hard I thought I might be sick. He wanted a shortcut that would have looked efficient on paper and blown up later in reality. I laid out the risks, stayed calm, and didn't back down when he tried to push. He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded once and said, "Good call." That was the day it clicked. At home, no had always been treated like a personal attack, a challenge, an invitation to argue until someone won. In the Army, no was information, a stop sign. You didn't run it unless you wanted to explain yourself to people with very little patience for excuses. That difference shaped me more than any medal ever could. By the time I moved into operational planning, I'd learned how to hold a line without raising my voice, how to listen without agreeing, how to document everything without sounding defensive. Those skills translated well when I was later assigned as a liaison bridging military needs with civilian contractors who weren't used to being told they couldn't have what they wanted. Funny enough, that role also paid well. My parents never quite grasped that part. To them, Army pay meant a base salary they'd looked up once and decided wasn't impressive. They ignored bonuses, allowances, and the fact that I didn't spend money the way Ashley did. I invested. I planned. I lived within my means because I never assumed tomorrow was guaranteed. The Penthouse hadn't been a splurge. It was proximity to base. Security. A place I could return to without explaining myself to anyone. I bought it the same way I handled everything else: paperwork, clean financing, transparent numbers that made sense long term. At home, none of that mattered. Perception beat reality every time. As I drove, my phone lit up again. This time I glanced at it long enough to see my mother's name before setting it face down in the console. I didn't need to read whatever she was about to say. I already knew the categories: justification, minimization, guilt, maybe an apology shaped like a complaint. I focused instead on the road and the familiar process of organizing facts in my head. Public incident, witnesses, physical contact, recorded evidence, relationship between parties, potential impact on my position. None of it required dramatics. It required accuracy. That's another thing the Army teaches you. You don't get to control how people react to your choices, but you do get to control how clean your own hands are. If something goes sideways, the first question isn't who felt wronged. It's who followed procedure. I had. Back at the hotel, my family had expected me to do what I'd always done: absorb the pressure, smooth things over, give them what they wanted so the evening could continue uninterrupted. They'd counted on my discomfort being stronger than my resolve. They miscalculated. I pulled up to a red light and waited, the engine idling softly. A couple crossed the street in front of me, laughing, unaware of the wedding imploding a few miles away. That's the thing about scenes. They feel enormous when you're inside them. From the outside, life keeps moving. My phone vibrated again. A text this time. Not from my parents. I glanced down at it. "You did the right thing. Don't engage." Short, direct. From someone who didn't need a backstory to understand what mattered. I set the phone aside and eased forward when the light turned green. Ashley had always said I was rigid, that I took things too seriously. What she really meant was that I didn't bend when bending benefited everyone except me. She'd grown up watching our parents reward compliance and punish resistance, then concluded that resistance itself was the problem. She never saw what happened when compliance became habit. In the Army, people like that get used up quickly. They're reliable until they aren't. Trusted until something goes wrong and there's no documentation to protect them. I'd watched good soldiers burn out because they couldn't say no without feeling like they were failing someone. I wasn't going to join them. As I turned onto my street, the buildings grew quieter, the traffic thinner. The city felt different here. Slower. More deliberate. I parked, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands resting on my thighs. The mark on my cheek throbbed in time with my pulse, now less sharp, more insistent. A reminder, not a wound. I stepped out of the car and locked it, the click of the doors echoing softly. As I walked toward my building, I noticed the doorman glance up, then quickly look away, professional as always. If he'd seen the video, he didn't show it. I appreciated that more than he knew. Inside the elevator, I leaned back against the wall as it rose, the hum steady and predictable. When the doors opened, the hallway. Lights came on, automatically illuminating the familiar stretch of carpet and doors. My door waited at the end, unchanged, exactly where I'd left it. I unlocked it and stepped inside, setting my clutch down on the counter and kicking off my shoes. The quiet wrapped around me immediately. No questions, no commentary, just space. I moved into the bathroom and turned on the light, studying my reflection again. The redness was deeper now, clearer, unmistakable. I reached into the cabinet for an ice pack, pressed it gently against my cheek, and held it there, feeling the cold seep in. Not to numb anything, just to keep the swelling down. Practical, efficient. Standing there, I thought about how many times I'd been told that family meant enduring whatever was thrown at you. That loyalty required sacrifice, that keeping the peace was more important than keeping yourself intact. The Army had taught me something different. Loyalty without boundaries isn't loyalty, it's liability. I lowered the ice pack, checked the mirror one last time, and turned off the light, already shifting my attention to the steps I'd take next, the same way I always did when something crossed a line and needed to be addressed without noise or negotiation. The ice pack left a faint chill on my skin as I set it back in the freezer and reached for a glass of water, the apartment quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator hum. I took a slow sip, then another, standing barefoot on the kitchen tile and letting the silence do its job. This place had never been about showing off. From the first day I'd walk through the empty rooms, keys still warm in my hand, the appeal had been simple. Close to base. Secure building. Solid construction. No wasted space pretending to be something it wasn't. A place where I could come home from leave, or a late briefing, and not have to explain myself to anyone. My parents saw a penthouse and filled in the rest with assumptions. They pictured trust funds, backroom deals, someone helping me out. They'd asked vague questions early on, the kind designed to invite me to confess to something. When I didn't, they moved on to a more comfortable conclusion: I couldn't have done this on my own. I never corrected them. In the Army, you learn quickly that not everyone deserves the full explanation. Some people don't want the truth. They want a version that keeps them comfortable. I leaned against the counter and looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights stretched out below, steady and indifferent. Tomorrow morning, I'd wake up here, make coffee, and get on with my life. That predictability mattered more to me than any reaction it might provoke. The paperwork for this place had been clean. Via loan. Bonus from a completed contract. Years of saving. No shortcuts. No favors. I'd chosen this building because it met requirements, not because it made a statement. That detail never seemed to stick with my family. To them, it was a prize. They'd started testing that idea months before the wedding. Small comments at first. Jokes that weren't quite jokes. Must be nice, my mother had said once, eyes lingering a beat too long. So much space for just one person. My father had laughed and added, "You know, places like that are meant for families." I'd smiled, non-committal, the way you do when you don't want to open a door that can't be closed easily. Ashley had been less subtle. She'd visited once, sweeping through the rooms like she was already imagining her furniture in them. "It's kind of wasted on you," she'd said, not unkindly. "I mean, you're barely here." That was the moment I understood they weren't curious. They were inventorying. I pushed off the counter and walked through the living room, straightening a cushion that didn't need it. Habit again. The Army does that to you. You put things where they belong because order is a form of respect even when no one else is watching. My phone buzzed on the table. I ignored it. This place had never been offered. Not for holidays. Not for visits. Not as a backup plan. That boundary had been clear to me from the start, even if I hadn't said it out loud. Some things you don't negotiate until someone tries to take them. The wedding had turned that quiet line into a spotlight. Standing in that ballroom earlier, listening to my father's voice announce something that wasn't his to give, I'd felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear. Recognition. The same sensation you get when a conversation crosses from misunderstanding into strategy. They hadn't asked because asking leaves room for refusal. They'd chosen the timing carefully. Big room, big audience. A moment when saying no would look like cruelty. They'd assumed the optics would do the work for them. That I'd calculate the cost of resistance and decide it wasn't worth it. That calculation had changed a long time ago. I walked into the bedroom and set my dress over the back of a chair, then hung it neatly in the closet. The uniform stayed where it was pressed and ready, a silent reminder that this wasn't my first time navigating pressure with consequences attached. I'd earned this place the same way I'd earned everything else. By meeting requirements. By doing the work. By not quitting when it got uncomfortable. My parents had never understood that kind of earning. Their world ran on proximity and leverage, on who owed whom and how much. They'd taught Ashley that love was transactional even if they never used the word. I crossed the room and checked the locks one by one. Front door, balcony, habit. The solid click of each mechanism was reassuring, not because I felt unsafe, but because it confirmed something tangible. This space answered to me. In the living room, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen long enough to see a group message notification light up then darken. Family thread. I didn't open it. I'd learned early that once a narrative starts spinning, jumping in rarely stops it. It just gives people more material to work with. Silence, on the other hand, forces everyone else to fill the space themselves. I poured the rest of the water down the sink and rinsed the glass, setting it in the rack. The mark on my cheek had deepened into a bruise now, a faint purple blooming under the skin. It didn't hurt much anymore. It just existed. Evidence has a way of doing that. My parents liked to frame my choices as temporary. A career that would end. An apartment I'd grow out of. A phase they'd tolerate until I came back around. Owning something permanent disrupted that story, so they'd tried to rewrite it. I moved back to the window and rested my hands on the sill, watching traffic flow below. Somewhere across town, the reception was still trying to recover. Glasses being refilled. Music turned up a little too loud. Smiles stretched into place. They could keep pretending for the night. I wasn't interested in pretending anymore. This place wasn't just where I lived. It was where my decisions landed. Where I could come back from a deployment, close the door, and know that nothing inside these walls would demand more than I was willing to give. The idea that it could be taken, announced away, handed over like a party favor said more about them than it ever could about me. I picked up my phone and finally unlocked the screen, scrolling past missed calls without opening any of them. One message sat unread from earlier, a simple check-in from someone who understood what lines meant and why they mattered. I replied with a single word. Home. Then I set the phone down, turned off the lights in the living room, and let the apartment settle back into its normal rhythm, already adjusting to the fact that what had been assumed was never actually available. I set my phone face down on the counter and walked back toward the kitchen, the soft click of my footsteps echoing in the open space. The apartment felt steady, grounded like it always did when I needed it to. That steadiness made it easier to remember exactly when I first realized the wedding wasn't just about celebration. It had been earlier that afternoon, before the guests arrived, before the music, before the room filled with noise and expectation. I'd stepped away from the main ballroom to grab a stack of programs from a side table near the service hallway. The planners were rushing back and forth, headsets on, voices low but urgent. No one paid attention to me. I blended in easily when I wanted to. Years of standing quietly at the edge of rooms had taught me that invisibility can be useful. That was when I heard my mother say my name, not loudly, not angrily, just enough to be sure it stayed between the people she intended to hear it. Her tone was casual, practiced the way she spoke when she thought she was being reasonable. "She won't make a scene," she said, "not today." My father murmured something in response. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the sound. Agreement without curiosity. I paused, program still tucked under my arm, my body going still before my mind caught up. It wasn't suspicion yet. Just awareness. "She knows what this means for Ashley," my mother continued. "And she won't embarrass us in front of everyone." That was when I leaned back slightly out of sight and listened. They weren't discussing possibilities. They weren't weighing options. They were talking like the decision had already been made, and the only variable left was timing. My father cleared his throat. "Once it's announced, she'll have no choice. People will be watching." There it was. The leverage. The room. The moment. My mother made a small, satisfied sound. She always folds when it matters. The words landed cleanly. No anger. No surprise. Just a statement of fact as far as they were concerned. I stood there longer than I needed to, letting the picture come into focus. This wasn't about asking for help or making a generous gesture. This was about cornering me into compliance by using the one thing I'd spent years trying not to disrupt: the appearance of harmony. Ashley joined them a few seconds later, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Everything okay?" she asked, light and unconcerned. My mother smiled. "Of course." Ashley laughed, brushing it off. "Rachel's going to freak out, isn't she?" "No," my father said. "She won't." Ashley shrugged. "I mean, it's just an apartment. She can get another one." That was it. No malice. No planning on her part. Just entitlement so ingrained it didn't register as anything else. I stepped back then quietly and continued down the hall like I'd never stopped moving. No one noticed. No one called after me. To them, the matter was settled. I carried the programs back to the table and set them down neatly, my hands steady. Inside, something shifted. Not panic. Not hurt. Recognition again. The same clarity you get when an operation reveals itself earlier than expected. They weren't hoping I'd say yes. They were counting on it. The rest of the afternoon unfolded around that knowledge. Every smile from my mother felt staged. Every friendly comment from my father sounded rehearsed. Even the way Ashley avoided my eyes at times made sense now. She wasn't nervous about the wedding. She was nervous about the reveal. I didn't confront them. There was no benefit to that. Confrontation invites negotiation, and negotiation was exactly what they wanted. If I objected privately, they could adjust, soften it, frame it as a misunderstanding. That would have robbed me of the one thing I needed: the truth of what they were trying to do. Instead, I watched. I noticed how my mother positioned herself near the microphone during sound check. How my father kept glancing toward me whenever the subject of gifts came up in conversation. How Ashley joked loudly about big surprises while pretending not to know anything. By the time the ceremony ended and the reception began, I knew the shape of the trap. I knew when it would spring. I even knew the language they'd use to make it sound generous instead of coercive. Standing in the ballroom, later champagne glass in hand, I felt strangely calm. There's a relief that comes with clarity. Once you stop wondering whether something might happen, you can focus on how you'll respond when it does. They'd chosen the stage carefully. Public enough to shame refusal. Emotional enough to paint resistance as cruelty. Formal enough to make interruption feel inappropriate. It was a classic maneuver, one I'd seen before in different contexts dressed up with different words. The mistake they made was assuming my only concern would be the room. They didn't consider that I might value consistency over comfort. That I might accept being judged by strangers if it meant not betraying myself. That I might choose a short burst of chaos over a lifetime of quiet concessions. As the reception progressed, my mother's confidence grew. I could see it in her posture, the way she laughed a little louder, touched people's arms a little longer. She believed she'd already won. My father avoided my eyes. That was new. He'd always preferred indirect pressure, letting my mother lead while he stayed just far enough back to claim plausible deniability. Ashley floated through the room, radiant, untouched by any sense of consequence. She thanked me again for helping with the wedding, squeezed my hand, and said, "I knew I could count on you," like the words themselves were binding. I smiled and said nothing. The announcement came exactly when I expected it to. Right after the toasts. Right when everyone was relaxed, full, slightly buzzed, and receptive to sentiment. My father stood, tapped his glass, and launched into a speech about family and sacrifice and generosity. Every phrase had been chosen to narrow the space around me. When he said my name, the room turned as one. Faces bright with anticipation. Phones lifted instinctively. Someone started clapping before he'd even finished the sentence. In that moment, I understood something else, something quieter but just as important. They hadn't just planned to take my penthouse. They'd planned to make my refusal look like a betrayal, to rewrite years of my support into a single moment of selfishness. They wanted the story. What they didn't account for was my willingness to let that story break in public rather than carry it alone in private. Standing there, listening to my father's words spill into the microphone, I felt the weight of the room press in the way it was meant to. I also felt the outline of the line I wasn't willing to cross sharpen into something solid. The trap was set. Not because I was unaware of it, but because they believed awareness wouldn't matter. They were wrong. The applause started before my father even finished speaking. It rolled through the room in uneven waves, people clapping because everyone else was clapping. Because that's what you do when a speech sounds generous and you don't yet know what it costs. I stayed where I was. My father's voice came through the speakers again, warmer now practiced. He talked about family, about how proud he was of both his daughters, about sacrifice and love and starting a new chapter. The words were familiar. He'd used variations of them my entire life, usually right before asking me to give something up. And that's why he said, smiling out at the room, Rachel has decided to give Ashley and her husband her penthouse as a wedding gift. For a brief second, the room went silent. Not shocked silence. Anticipatory silence. The kind that waits for confirmation. Every head turned toward me. I felt it immediately, that collective focus, 200 sets of eyes landing all at once. Phones lifted higher. Someone near the front gasped softly, like this was better than whatever they'd expected. A woman at the back whispered, "Wow," like she was watching a reveal on a game show. My father looked at me, then finally his smile fixed in place. It wasn't a question. It was a cue. My mother had already turned in her chair, watching me closely, ready to step in if I hesitated. Ashley stared at me with wide eyes. Her hands clasped together, the picture of surprise she hadn't had time to rehearse properly. I set my champagne glass down on the table beside me. The sound it made wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise in my head. Crystal on linen. Clean. Final. I never agreed to that, I said. My voice didn't shake. I didn't raise it either. I didn't need to. The microphone carried it easily, and the silence that followed was different from before. Thicker. Confused. My father's smile flickered. Just for a moment. Rachel, he said, still holding the microphone, still performing. Don't do this here. Do what I asked. I kept my tone neutral, the way I would in a briefing when someone tried to redirect responsibility without addressing the facts. Give away property that belongs to me. A ripple moved through the crowd. People shifted in their chairs. Someone coughed. The band members exchanged looks, hands hovering over their instruments. My mother stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "Sweetheart," she said, reaching for the microphone, "this is a misunderstanding." "It isn't," I said. Ashley finally spoke, her voice small but audible. "Rachel, it's just a place. You don't even live there full time." I looked at her then. Really looked. She wasn't angry. She wasn't calculating. She was genuinely confused as to why this wasn't already settled. In her world, my things had always been available when needed. "It's my home," I said. "And no one discussed this with me." My father's jaw tightened. "We're talking about family," he said. "This isn't the time to be selfish." There it was. The pivot. Turn refusal into character flaw. A few people nodded along instinctively. Others looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. I recognized that moment too. The one where the crowd decides whether to keep cheering or start thinking. "I'm not being selfish," I said. "I'm being clear." My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice, but forgetting the microphone still picked it up. "You're embarrassing us." I didn't respond to that. Embarrassment is a feeling. This was a fact pattern. I did not agree to give my penthouse to anyone, I said again. Not privately. Not publicly. My father laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You can afford another one." That was the line that changed the temperature in the room. I met his eyes. "Then you can buy her one." Gasps followed that, louder this time. Someone actually laughed, then stopped abruptly when no one joined in. The photographer's camera clicked rapidly, capturing angles no one would be able to spin later. My mother's face flushed. "After everything we've done for you," she said. "After all the support." "What support?" I asked. Not loudly, just enough. That stopped her. Ashley looked between us, panic creeping into her expression now. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Today of all days." I took a breath. Slow, controlled. The kind that keeps you from saying something you can't walk back. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm not giving away my home." The room buzzed. Whispers layered over each other. I caught fragments. Ungrateful. Poor timing. Why make a scene? I also caught something else. Confusion. Doubt. A few people weren't buying what my parents were selling. My mother reached for my arm. I stepped back. That movement, small as it was, seemed to trigger something in her. Years of expectation collided with resistance in real time. Her hand hovered for a fraction of a second, then swung. The sound was louder than before. A clean, sharp crack that echoed off the walls. My head snapped to the side. Heat flared across my cheek. The room inhaled as one. Somewhere near my feet, my earring hit the floor and skidded away. No one spoke. My mother's hand stayed raised, fingers curled slightly like she couldn't quite believe what she'd just done. The microphone in her other hand picked up her breathing fast and uneven. I straightened slowly. The pain was there, but it wasn't overwhelming. What surprised me more was how clear everything felt. No adrenaline, no tunnel vision, just focus. I bent down and picked up the earring, my movements deliberate. I could feel the cameras tracking me, could sense the phones recording without needing to see them. When I stood up, I put the earring back on. Then I looked at my mother. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The line had been crossed so publicly, so unmistakably that words would have been redundant. I turned away from her and faced the room. "I'm leaving," I said. "Congratulations." That was it. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't look back to see who followed or who protested. I picked up my clutch, adjusted it over my shoulder, and walked toward the exit as the room erupted behind me. Voices overlapping chairs, scraping the wedding, collapsing into noise. Each step felt steady, measured, familiar. By the time I reached the doors, my cheek was throbbing and my phone was already vibrating in my bag. Notifications stacking up faster than I could count. I pushed through the doors and stepped into the hallway, the noise cutting off, abruptly replaced by quiet and the soft hum of the lights overhead. For the first time that night, no one was telling me what I owed them. I kept moving. The hallway carpet muffled the sound of my heels as I moved away from the ballroom, each step steady, automatic, like my body had already decided what came next, even if my mind hadn't caught up yet. My cheek pulsed with a dull, rhythmic ache, not sharp anymore, just present, a reminder that something irreversible had happened without needing my attention every second. I didn't stop until I reached the elevator. When the doors slid open, I stepped inside alone. The mirrored walls reflected me back from every angle. The red mark on my cheek was impossible to miss now. Clear, defined, no ambiguity. I pressed the lobby button and watched the doors close, sealing off the noise upstairs. As the elevator descended, my phone started vibrating in my clutch again. I didn't pull it out right away. I knew who it would be. I also knew reading anything in that moment wouldn't improve my decision-making. The Army trains you for moments like this in ways that aren't obvious at first. Not for weddings or family confrontations, but for the seconds after something goes wrong and everyone around you wants an immediate reaction. That's when mistakes happen. That's when people say things they regret, or do things that complicate what should stay simple. The elevator dinged softly when it reached the lobby. I stepped out into the open space past guests who were still laughing, still holding drinks, still blissfully unaware of how quickly the celebration upstairs had turned into something else entirely. A few people glanced at me, then looked away, the instinctive discomfort of witnessing something they weren't sure how to categorize. Outside, the night air felt cooler against my skin. I paused just long enough to adjust the strap of my clutch on my shoulder, then walked toward the curb where my car was parked. The valet looked up, recognition flashing across his face. He hesitated, then handed me my keys without comment. I appreciated that. Once I was inside the car, the door closed, and the world narrowed to a quiet, familiar space. The smell of leather. The faint hum of the engine when I started it. I sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the adrenaline drain out in its own time. That's when I checked my phone. Missed calls, texts, voicemails stacking up faster than the screen could refresh. My mother, my father, Ashley. Numbers I didn't recognize. Group messages lighting up with fragments of panic and outrage. "How could you do this? This is your fault. Come back right now. You embarrassed us." I didn't reply. There was nothing to clarify. The facts were already public. Anything I said would only invite argument, and argument was the last thing I intended to give them. I pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, keeping my speed, even my focus, on the road. Somewhere behind me, the reception was unraveling in real time. I didn't need to see it to know how it would go. Raised voices, conflicting stories, My parents scrambling to regain control of a situation that had slipped past them the moment my mother's hand connected with my face. Control has a shelf life. My phone buzzed again. This time the name on the screen made me glance down longer than before. "You safe?" I answered that one. "Yes." Another message came through almost immediately. "Good. Don't engage with anyone tonight." I set the phone face down in the console and exhaled slowly. Back at the hotel, my family was probably still arguing about optics, about what could be salvaged, about who needed to say what to whom to make this go away. They'd always believed problems could be managed if you applied enough pressure in the right direction. What they didn't understand was that pressure only works when the other person still cares about being pushed. The mark on my cheek throbbed again as I waited at a red light, brighter now under the street lamp. I caught my reflection in the side mirror and studied it not with judgment, but with assessment. Swelling minimal, no broken skin, no medical emergency. That distinction mattered. Physical contact, though, especially in a public setting, crossed into territory that didn't belong to family dynamics or private explanations anymore. It moved the situation out of emotion and into record. I hadn't planned for my mother to hit me. No one plans for that. But I'd spent my career understanding what happens when lines are crossed in front of witnesses. The process doesn't care about intentions. It cares about actions. I turned onto the highway, the city lights blurring slightly at the edges as I settled into the lane. My phone vibrated again. Another unknown number. I ignored it. The Army doesn't reward impulsive responses. It rewards clean ones. By the time I reached my building, the buzzing in my phone had slowed, replaced by a heavier silence. I parked, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment before getting out, grounding myself in the simple facts of where I was and what was under my control. Inside, the lobby was quiet. The night staff nodded as I passed. If they'd heard anything, they didn't show it. I moved toward the elevator, pressing the button with the same steady pressure I always used, like consistency itself was a kind of shield. As the elevator rose, my phone buzzed again, then stopped. A voicemail notification appeared. I didn't open it. I knew my mother's patterns. Anger first, then justification, then a sudden pivot to tears and self-pity once she realized force hadn't worked. My father would follow with appeals to reason, framing everything as a misunderstanding that needed to be smoothed over quickly before it affected his reputation. Ashley would be last. Confused, hurt, insistent that I'd gone too far, even though she'd done nothing but benefit from the assumption that I'd give in. None of that required my participation. When the elevator doors opened onto my floor, the hallway lights flicked on automatically, bathing the carpet in a soft glow. I walked to my door, unlocked it, and stepped inside, the quiet closing around me like it always did. I set my clutch down, slipped off my shoes, and moved into the bathroom, turning on the light. The bruise had deepened the color, shifting the edges more defined. There was no hiding it now, not that I wanted to. I rinsed my hands at the sink, the cool water running over my fingers, and reached for an ice pack from the freezer, pressing it gently against my cheek. The cold helped not just physically but mentally. A small practical step, something concrete. Standing there, I thought about how many times I'd been told that saying no would cost me my family, that drawing a line would make things worse, that silence was the price of belonging. What no one ever mentioned was the cost of never drawing that line at all. I lowered the ice pack and set it on the counter, my reflection staring back at me, composed if not entirely unscathed. Somewhere across the city, my parents were still trying to put out fires they'd started themselves. Somewhere people were replaying the moment my mother's hand connected with my face, freezing it into a version of the story that no one could edit later. I turned off the bathroom light and walked back into the living room, my phone lighting up again on the table as another message came in. I didn't pick it up. For the first time that night, the chaos wasn't following me. I let the quiet hold. The ice pack left a damp ring on the counter when I set it down, and I wiped it away with the edge of a towel before it could soak in. Small habits like that keep things from turning messy. I poured myself a glass of water, drank half of it, then sat at the kitchen table with my phone in front of me and didn't touch it. Not responding was a choice, a deliberate one. I knew exactly how my family would interpret silence. They always had. To them it meant uncertainty, which they mistook for leverage. They believed if they kept pressing, I'd eventually crack just to stop the noise. That assumption had been wrong for a long time. They just hadn't noticed. I picked up the phone and scrolled to the call log, not to read messages, but to document what mattered. Times, numbers, missed calls. The Army doesn't expect you to remember everything perfectly after a public incident. It expects you to preserve what you can and avoid making it worse. I opened a new note and wrote a brief timeline while it was still clean in my head. Location, witnesses, sequence of events. I kept the language plain the way you do when facts need to stand on their own without decoration. When I finished, I saved it and closed the app. Only then did I make the call. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voice, no explanation layered with emotion. I identified myself, stated that I'd been involved in a public incident, and said I needed to report it according to procedure. The person on the other end didn't interrupt me. They took notes. They asked a few clarifying questions. They told me what would happen next. That was it. I hung up and set the phone back on the table. This was the part most people misunderstand when they hear stories like mine. They imagine revenge as confrontation. As a raised voice, a final speech, a moment designed for maximum impact. That kind of response feels satisfying in the moment and creates problems that linger long after the adrenaline wears off. I didn't want satisfaction. I wanted resolution. The system doesn't move fast because it's angry. It moves because it's consistent. Once something crosses into the category of public conduct, especially involving physical contact, it stops belonging to the people who caused it. It becomes a matter of record. That shift is what my parents never understood. They were still thinking in terms of control, damage control, reputation management. Who could be persuaded to say what and how quickly? They'd spent decades smoothing things over that way, confident they could outmaneuver discomfort if they acted decisively enough. What they hadn't prepared for was someone who wouldn't meet them on that field. I stood up and walked through the apartment, checking things I already knew were in order. Windows locked, door secure, lights where I wanted them. The familiar routine grounded me, not because I felt unsafe, but because order reinforces agency. My phone buzzed again. A voicemail this time. I didn't listen to it. I wasn't avoiding responsibility. I was protecting clarity. There's a difference. I changed into comfortable clothes, folding the dress I'd worn to the wedding and setting it aside. I washed my face, careful around the bruise, and caught my reflection in the mirror again. The mark was darker now, more pronounced, the kind of thing that wouldn't fade quickly. Good. I didn't want it to. Physical evidence removes ambiguity. It short-circuits arguments about tone and intent. It makes conversations shorter. I sat back down at the table and checked the time. Not late. Late enough that the reception would still be going, though not the way it was supposed to. I could picture my parents pacing, phones pressed to their ears, voices lowered but urgent. I could picture my father insisting this could still be fixed if everyone just calmed down. Calm had never been the issue. My phone lit up again. A text from Ashley this time. Why would you do this to us? I stared at the screen for a moment, then locked the phone without replying. Her question assumed intent, as if my goal had been to cause harm rather than to prevent it. That framing was familiar. It was how my family justified overstepping every boundary they'd ever crossed. If they were hurt, someone else must have caused it. I stood and opened the refrigerator, pulled out leftovers, and heated them in the microwave. The mundane act felt grounding. Eat, drink water, sleep when you can. That advice applies just as much after emotional impact as it does after physical strain. As I ate, I thought about the review process that would follow. It wouldn't be immediate. It wouldn't be dramatic. There would be questions, requests for statements, perhaps a reminder to avoid public commentary. All manageable, all clean. I'd accepted that the moment I made the call. Accepting review isn't an admission of fault. It's an acknowledgement that transparency protects everyone involved. I'd rather answer questions than answer rumors. My parents, on the other hand, would experience that transparency as an attack. They'd always preferred things handled quietly, privately, with just enough pressure applied to ensure the outcome they wanted. Formal processes didn't bend. That made them threatening. I finished eating and rinsed the plate, setting it in the rack. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a number I recognized, but hadn't expected to see so soon. I answered. I heard the voice said. "You okay?" "Yes," I said. I reported it. There was a brief pause. Not concern. Approval. "Good," they said. "That's the right call." We spoke for a few minutes. Nothing dramatic. No strategy session. Just confirmation of next steps, and a reminder to keep my communication limited and factual. When we hung up, I felt lighter, not because anything had been resolved, but because I wasn't carrying it alone. That was the difference. I returned to the living room and sat on the couch, my phone resting beside me. Messages continued to come in, then slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peace yet, but it was a start. Outside the city moved on. Traffic flowed. Lights flicked off in other buildings as people settled into their nights. Somewhere the wedding was being discussed in fragments and replays, opinions forming without my input. That was fine. I wasn't interested in controlling the narrative. I was interested in letting the consequences align with the actions that created them. I turned off the living room lights and stood stretching slightly as the day finally caught up with me. My cheeks still ached, but the pain had dulled into something manageable, something that didn't demand my attention. I walked toward the bedroom, already mentally organizing the next day the way I always did when something disrupted the routine. Tasks, calls, documentation, nothing dramatic, nothing rushed. Choosing a different kind of revenge doesn't feel like revenge at all when you're doing it right. It feels like order returning to a space that had been treated like it belonged to everyone else. I set my phone on this nightstand face down and lay back against the pillows. The quiet settling in around me, again steady and unbothered by anyone else's expectations. My phone vibrated against the nightstand before the sun fully cleared the buildings across the street, the low buzz pulling me awake without urgency. I reached for it on instinct, checked the time, and sat up, the bruise on my cheek tightening slightly as the muscles in my face moved. Messages had stacked up overnight. Not from my parents, not from Ashley, from people who hadn't been in the room but had still seen exactly what happened. Links, screenshots, short notes that didn't ask questions because they already knew the answers. I swung my legs out of bed and stood stretching once before heading to the bathroom. The mirror didn't lie. The mark was darker this morning, cleanly defined, the kind of injury no amount of spin could soften. I washed my face, dressed, and made coffee, letting the routine settle my breathing back into something steady. By the time the mug was warm in my hands, the first call came in. "Morning," the voice said. Calm, professional. "We're going to need a statement. Factual, no commentary." "I have it," I said. "Timeline and witnesses." "Good, send it over." I did. No edits, no additions, just the facts as they were. The system doesn't reward embellishment. It rewards consistency. As the morning progressed, the ripple effects became impossible to ignore. The video had moved beyond private feeds and into places my parents cared about. Industry group chats, local business forums, the kind of circles where reputations are currency and people pay attention when something doesn't add up. My phone rang again. "Are you aware your family owns a controlling interest in the caller began?" "I am," I said. "And I don't speak on their behalf." That answer ended the conversation faster than anything else could have. Another call came in, this one from someone I'd worked with years ago on a joint project. "Just wanted to check in," they said. "What I saw last night wasn't okay." "Thank you," I replied. "I'm handling it." They didn't push. That was the theme of the day. People didn't need convincing. They needed clarity, and the footage provided plenty of that. Around mid-morning, my phone finally rang with my father's number. I let it ring, not out of spite, out of practicality. Anything he had to say now would be about damage control, not accountability. I wasn't interested in being used as a shield against consequences that had already been set in motion. When I didn't answer, he left a voicemail. I didn't listen to it. By noon, the tone of the messages shifted. Less outrage, more panic. The words changed from accusations to requests, from demands to suggestions that maybe we should talk things through like adults. That phrase would have made me laugh if it hadn't been so predictable. Adults don't ambush. They don't strike. They don't assume ownership over things that aren't theirs. I stepped out onto the balcony with my coffee and looked down at the street below. The city was awake now. Traffic steady. People moving with purpose. Somewhere in that movement, my parents were realizing that what they treated as a private family matter had crossed into public record. And public record doesn't forget. An email came through mid-afternoon from a compliance officer associated with my father's company. Polite, measured, requesting clarification on a matter involving public conduct and leadership judgment. They didn't mention names. They didn't have to. I forwarded it to the appropriate contact and went back to what I'd been doing. That's another thing people get wrong about consequences. They expect them to arrive all at once, dramatic and unmistakable. In reality, they arrive quietly, one question at a time, until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. Later that day, a message came through from Ashley. "Can we please talk? Dad is freaking out." I read it once and set the phone down. Her concern wasn't about me. It was about the discomfort spreading outward now that it was no longer contained. She'd lived her whole life believing someone else would step in to absorb the impact when things went wrong. This time, no one was stepping in. By early evening, my phone rang with a number I recognized from a previous audit process. I answered, listened, and answered a series of questions that stayed firmly within the bounds of fact. When the call ended, I felt something settle into place. Not relief and awe, but inevitability. There are moments when you can feel the direction of events shift, when the outcome becomes less about effort and more about gravity. This was one of them. I made dinner, ate, and cleaned up, letting the normalcy of the actions keep my mind anchored. When I checked my phone again, there was a new voicemail notification from my mother. Against my better judgment, I listened. Her voice was tight, controlled in a way that suggested she'd already cycled through anger and landed on fear. She didn't apologize. She reframed. She talked about misunderstandings and stress and how quickly things had escalated. She said the word family more times than I could count, as if repetition might restore its original meaning. When the message ended, I didn't feel tempted to respond. Apologies that arrive only after consequences aren't apologies. They're negotiations. As the evening wore on, the external reactions continued. A canceled meeting here, a postponed call there. Small adjustments that signaled something larger taking shape. People distancing themselves just enough to protect their own interests. That's how systems work. They don't react emotionally. They adjust. I sat back on the couch and let the quiet settle again, the same quiet that had greeted me the night before. It felt different now, heavier, more deliberate. Somewhere across town, my parents were likely still making calls, still insisting this could be managed if everyone just calmed down and stopped overreacting. They'd built their lives on the assumption that access equaled control. They were learning in real time that access can be revoked. My phone buzzed one last time before I set it aside for the night. A short message from someone whose opinion I respected. "You handled this correctly. Let it run its course." I placed the phone face down and leaned back, my gaze drifting toward the darkened windows. The city lights reflected faintly against the glass, steady and indifferent. Consequences don't announce themselves, they accumulate. And once they start, they don't require your participation to keep moving. The locks clicked into place with a solid, familiar sound as I turned the deadbolt and rested my hand there for a second longer than necessary. Not because I was worried someone would come through the door, but because the sound itself meant something now. It marked a boundary that didn't need to be explained. I changed the codes that morning. Building access, garage entry, guest permissions. The property manager didn't ask questions beyond what was required. He'd seen the video like everyone else. When I handed over the updated list of names barred from entry, he nodded once and said, "Understood." No hesitation, no commentary. That was enough. Back inside the apartment felt lighter. Not quieter, just clearer. The same furniture, the same view, the same morning light spilling across the floor. What had shifted wasn't the space. It was the assumption of who had access to it. My phone stayed on the counter while I made coffee. Messages still came in, but fewer now. The urgency had drained out of them. Panic gives way to recalculation eventually. That's when people reveal what they actually value. I took my mug to the window and watched the city wake up, the familiar pattern of movement grounding me. Somewhere in that motion, my parents were adjusting to a version of reality where their reach didn't extend as far as it used to. I didn't feel triumphant. That surprised me. I'd expected some rush of satisfaction, some sense of victory. Instead, what I felt was calm, the kind that settles in when you stop bracing for impact. The Army teaches you that not every win looks dramatic. Sometimes success is simply the absence of chaos you didn't invite. Later that day, a message came through from my father. Shorter than the others, stripped of theatrics. "We need to talk." I read it once and set the phone back down. Need is a strong word. It implies urgency, dependency, obligation. None of which applied anymore. A few hours after that, a formal statement appeared online. Carefully worded. Approved by lawyers. My father acknowledged inappropriate behavior at a family event and emphasized his commitment to professionalism moving forward. He didn't name me directly. He didn't apologize to me personally. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't enough. It didn't need to be. The system had done what it was designed to do. Investigations completed. Reviews concluded. Adjustments made. Quiet procedural consequences that didn't require my input to keep unfolding. Ashley tried one last time. I didn't recognize the number at first, but I recognized the tone immediately. Defensive, hurt, still framing herself as the person something had been done to. "You didn't have to go that far," she said. "This could have stayed in the family." "It did," I replied. "Until it didn't." She sighed like that settled it in her mind. "You always do this. You choose work. You choose rules. You never choose us." I didn't argue. Choosing peace sometimes looks like refusing to relitigate the same conversation for the 100th time. "I chose myself," I said. "That's not the same thing." She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there for a moment afterward, phone in hand, waiting for the familiar tug of guilt. It didn't come. What came instead was a quiet understanding that I'd been confusing proximity with responsibility for years. Blood creates connection. It doesn't guarantee respect. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Work continued. Meetings, planning sessions, briefings. People who knew what had happened didn't bring it up unless I did. Those who didn't know didn't need to. I donated the dress I'd worn to the wedding. It felt right to let it go. Not as a statement, just as a practical choice. It no longer belonged in my closet. The bruise on my cheek faded slowly, leaving behind a faint discoloration that disappeared completely after a few weeks. No scar, no visible reminder. I didn't miss it when it was gone. What stayed was the clarity. I stopped checking my family group chat. Eventually, it went quiet on its own. I blocked numbers that needed blocking. I kept lines open where they made sense and closed the rest without announcement. No grand speech, no final message, just consistent action. One evening, not long after I came home late and dropped my bag by the door, the apartment greeting me with the same steady silence it always had. I kicked off my shoes, poured a glass of water, and sat on the couch, watching the city lights blink on one by one. This place had never asked me to shrink, never asked me to explain, never demanded that I trade dignity for approval. That mattered. People talk a lot about forgiveness, about closure, about repairing relationships at any cost. They rarely talk about what it takes to build a life where those conversations aren't necessary to begin with. I didn't forgive my parents that night. I didn't write them off in anger either. I simply stepped out of the role they'd assigned me and declined to take on a new one. That's not revenge, that's alignment. The Army taught me many things, but one lesson stood out above the rest. You are responsible for what you tolerate. Not what others do, but what you allow to continue. I'd tolerated enough. I finished my water and stood turning off the lights as I moved toward the bedroom. The apartment settled around me, familiar and unchanged the way it always did when I returned to it on my own terms. Tomorrow would come with its own set of tasks, calls to return, decisions to make, nothing dramatic, nothing personal, just life steady and intact, moving forward without the weight of expectations that were never mine to carry in the first place. I didn't walk away angry. I walked away clear. Clear about what I earned, what I owned, and what I was no longer willing to give up just to keep other people comfortable. Family revenge stories don't always end with shouting or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes they end with boundaries that finally stick, with silence that protects your peace, and with the quiet understanding that respect matters more than shared DNA. Family drama only has power when you keep playing your assigned role. The moment you stop, everything changes. If stories like this resonate with you, real family revenge stories about standing your ground, choosing self-respect and refusing to be controlled, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, and they're all about reclaiming your life without apology.